Too Big to Fail: The Inside Story of How Wall Street and Washington Fought to Save the Financial System and Themselves by Andrew Ross Sorkin. Picture this. It's just after 7 in the morning on a Saturday, September 13th, 2008. Most of the world is still asleep, blissfully unaware that they're standing at the edge of a financial cliff. In the hushed library of his Park Avenue apartment, Jamie Dimon, the powerhouse CEO of J.P. Morgan Chase, America's third-largest bank, is dialing into a conference call with his top 24 executives. His head is throbbing, not from last night's martini, but because he knows something the rest of the world is about to learn the hard way. The system is breaking. He tells his team, "You are about to experience the most unbelievable week in America ever, and we have to prepare for the absolutely worst case." His staff is listening, but they're not really getting it. Like most people, they figure the government will swoop in and save the day. That's when Dimon hits them with a cold splash of reality. "That's wishful thinking," he says. "There is no way, in my opinion, that Washington is going to bail out an investment bank. Nor should they." Then he drops the bombshell, a doomsday scenario so extreme it makes everyone on the call catch their breath. He tells them to prepare, right now, for the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers. He pauses. "And for Merrill Lynch filing." Another pause. "And for AIG filing." The silence stretches out. "And for Morgan Stanley filing." One final, terrifying beat. "And potentially for Goldman Sachs filing." This wasn't a scene from some Hollywood thriller. This actually happened. Andrew Ross Sorkin captured this real moment in his masterpiece, Too Big to Fail. This book isn't some dry economics textbook that'll put you to sleep. It's a minute-by-minute, fly-on-the-wall thriller that takes you inside the most powerful boardrooms and government offices during the 2008 financial crisis. Sorkin, a legendary journalist for the New York Times, spent over 500 hours interviewing more than 200 people who were right there in the arena: the CEOs, the Treasury Secretary, the regulators. He got his hands on their private notes, their emails, even their calendars. The result? A story about a handful of people, flawed, brilliant, and often terrified, who held the fate of the global economy in their hands. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on this story. By the time we're done, you won't just understand what happened in 2008. You'll understand the fragile, interconnected world of high finance, the clash of massive egos, and the terrifying truth that the people in charge were often just winging it, staring into an economic abyss and praying they wouldn't fall. This is the inside story of how the world almost ended. To understand how we got to that terrifying Saturday morning in 2008, we need to rewind the clock a bit. Back to a time that felt like a golden age, when Wall Street seemed to have discovered the secret formula for printing money. In the years leading up to the crisis, the financial industry was a well-oiled machine. In 2007, it raked in over 40% of all corporate profits in the United States. The men running these firms weren't just bankers. They saw themselves as titans, as geniuses who had engineered a new era of low-risk wealth. They were creating fortunes not seen since the roaring 80s, with total compensation hitting an eye-watering $53 billion in 2007 alone. Lloyd Blankfein, CEO of Goldman Sachs, personally took home $68 million that year. The fuel powering this machine? Cheap money. Interest rates were incredibly low for years, flooding the world with cash. And Wall Street, with all its brilliant minds, created a whole new set of fantastically complex toys to play with. They took one of the most basic pieces of the American dream, the home mortgage, and completely transformed it. Here's how it worked. A bank gives a family a loan to buy a house. In the old days, the bank would hold on to that loan, collecting payments for 30 years. But the new Wall Street had what they thought was a better idea. Why not take thousands of these mortgages, slice them up into tiny pieces, blend them all together like a giant financial smoothie, and then sell off those pieces to investors all over the world? This process was called securitization. The supposed genius of it was that it spread the risk around. If one family couldn't pay their mortgage, it wouldn't matter much, because your little piece of that smoothie was mixed in with thousands of others. The risk was diluted to almost nothing. At least, that's what they thought. This led to an absolute explosion in mortgage lending, especially subprime mortgages, loans given to people with sketchy credit who, in the past, would never have qualified for a home loan. At the height of the housing bubble, banks were practically throwing money at people. You could claim a six-figure salary with zero documentation and walk out with a $500,000 mortgage. Home prices shot through the roof. Everyone was getting rich. But there was a hidden danger lurking beneath the surface, a fatal flaw in the machine. These new financial products, called collateralized debt obligations or CDOs, were so ridiculously complex that almost no one, not even the CEOs of the banks selling them, truly understood what was inside them. And here's the kicker. The banks weren't just selling these smoothies to others. They were guzzling them down themselves. They bought billions of dollars of these mortgage-backed assets from each other, creating this tangled, invisible web of connections. Every firm was now dependent on every other firm, and many didn't even realize it. It was a global financial system built like a house of cards. Then, in 2007, the first gust of wind arrived. The housing bubble burst. Home prices started falling. Suddenly, those supposedly risk-free subprime mortgages started going bad, and the whole house of cards began to wobble. By August 2007, the $2 trillion subprime market had collapsed, and the damage spread globally. The problem was, nobody could figure out what these complex mortgage assets were actually worth anymore. Without a clear price, the market for them completely froze. And without access to capital, Wall Street simply couldn't function. The first major casualty was Bear Stearns, the smallest and scrappiest of Wall Street's 5 big investment houses. Over one shocking weekend in March 2008, rumors that panicky investors were refusing to trade with Bear turned into a full-blown run on the bank. In an industry that runs entirely on confidence, Bear Stearns had lost it all. This is where our story really kicks into gear, with the government facing its first impossible choice. On one side was the principle of the free market. Let failing companies fail. On the other was the terrifying reality of systemic risk. Bear Stearns was so connected to every other bank that letting it collapse could trigger a domino effect, potentially taking down the entire financial system. The man in the hot seat was Henry Paulson, the Secretary of the Treasury, a straight-shooting Midwesterner and former CEO of the mighty Goldman Sachs. Paulson believed deeply in free markets. He hated the idea of bailouts. But as he stared into the abyss, he blinked. Over one frantic weekend, Paulson and Tim Geithner, the intense, youthful president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, brokered what amounted to a shotgun marriage. They orchestrated a deal for J.P. Morgan Chase, led by the shrewd Jamie Dimon, to buy the dying Bear Stearns. But to make it happen, the government had to do something unprecedented. The Federal Reserve agreed to take on up to $29 billion of Bear's worst, most toxic assets. It was a bailout, plain and simple. And it sent a message to Wall Street that would have devastating consequences. Just 6 months later, the government would not let a major bank fail. Or so everyone thought. The man at the center of the next storm was Richard S. Fuld Jr., the CEO of Lehman Brothers. Known on Wall Street as the Gorilla, Fuld was an intimidating, laser-focused trader who had clawed his way to the top and had run Lehman with an iron fist for years. He was fiercely, almost obsessively loyal to his firm, a place he had rebuilt from scratch after it was spun off from American Express in 1994, undercapitalized and expected to fail. But Fuld had proven everyone wrong, turning Lehman into a profit machine that stood alongside Goldman Sachs. When Bear Stearns collapsed, Fuld knew that Lehman, as the next smallest of the big investment banks, was now in the crosshairs. But he was a fighter. He believed his firm was different, stronger. When the crisis hit, he proudly announced, "Is it going to kill us? Of course not." But Fuld had some serious blind spots. Like everyone else on Wall Street, he had become addicted to the high-risk, high-reward game of leverage, borrowing massive amounts of money to amplify his bets. Lehman was leveraged 30 to 1, meaning for every dollar of its own capital, it had borrowed 30. It was a strategy that worked spectacularly on the way up, but was absolutely catastrophic on the way down. His biggest blind spot, though, was his number two, a man named Joseph Gregory. Gregory was Fold's opposite, personable and less confrontational. He was Fold's chief operating officer and closest confidant. But many inside Lehman saw him as a problem, someone who played chess with people's careers, moving executives into positions they weren't qualified for, all while he himself grew increasingly disconnected from the risks the firm was taking. It was Gregory who championed Lehman's aggressive push into commercial real estate, leveraged lending, and mortgages, the very businesses that were now unraveling. In the spring of 2008, after the Bear Stearns collapse, a young, influential hedge fund manager named David Einhorn began publicly questioning Lehman's accounting. Einhorn was a quiet, analytical investor known for his meticulous research. At a major investment conference, he delivered a devastating presentation, methodically picking apart Lehman's financial statements. He argued the firm was hiding the true extent of its losses in its real estate portfolio. "It's time to dispense with the personal attacks," Einhorn warned, referring to Fold's constant complaints about short sellers, "and get down to an analysis of what's really going on with this business." Einhorn's speech was a direct hit on Lehman's credibility, and it landed hard. The firm's stock began a steady, grinding decline. Fold was furious. He saw it as a conspiracy, a group of short sellers trying to destroy his company. He launched a crusade against them, calling regulators, powerful friends, even news anchors, trying to get anyone, to stop the attack. But the problem wasn't the short sellers. The problem was reality. Lehman was sitting on a mountain of bad real estate assets that were losing value every single day. As the firm's stock price crumbled, Fold's own executives began to turn on him. A group of senior bankers, led by the head of investment banking, Skip McGee, confronted Fold. They told him the market had lost confidence, not just in the firm's assets, but in its leadership. They delivered an ultimatum. He needed to fire his longtime partner, Joe Gregory. For Fold, it felt like the ultimate betrayal. "Joe Gregory is off the table," he roared. "He's been my partner for 25 years, but the pressure was relentless." In a series of heartbreaking meetings, Fold was forced to choose between his best friend and his firm. In early June, he finally pushed out Gregory, along with his controversial CFO Aaron Callan, in a desperate attempt to restore confidence. He promoted a well-respected executive, Bart McDade, to be his new president. But it was too little, too late. The bleeding wouldn't stop. Fold began a frantic, globe-trotting search for someone to inject capital into the firm. He tried to woo Warren Buffett, but Buffett's terms were too expensive. He entered into lengthy, frustrating negotiations with the Korea Development Bank, but that deal fell apart in a spectacular clash of cultures and egos. By early September 2008, Lehman Brothers was on life support. Fold was running out of both options and time. That brings us to what would become the longest weekend in modern financial history. Friday, September 12, 2008. Lehman stock was in freefall. Henry Paulson, at the Treasury, knew he had to do something. He didn't want another bailout, but he couldn't risk another Bear Stearns-style panic. His plan was to force a private sector solution. He summoned the CEOs of every major Wall Street bank to an emergency meeting at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, that imposing stone fortress in downtown Manhattan. Scene inside was surreal. The titans of finance, bitter rivals, who spent every day trying to crush each other in the markets, were now gathered in one room, ordered to save one of their own. The only person not invited? Dick Fold. "Lehman Brothers is in a precarious position," Paulson told the assembled CEOs. "We're going to need to find a solution before the weekend is out." Then he drew a line in the sand. "It's not going to be government money," he stated flatly. "You're going to have to figure this out." The room was stunned. After the Bear Stearns rescue, everyone had assumed the government would always step in. Paulson was changing the rules in the middle of the game. He told them two potential buyers were at the table, Bank of America and the British bank Barclays. But neither would do a deal without help. The banks in that room, Paulson declared, would have to put up the money to finance the sale and absorb Lehman's toxic assets. What followed was a weekend of high-stakes poker, bluffing, and backstabbing. The first hope was Barclays. Their American CEO, Bob Diamond, was aggressive and saw a golden opportunity to buy Lehman's prestigious franchise for pennies on the dollar. All weekend, teams of bankers worked around the clock, trying to hammer out a deal. The other Wall Street banks, reluctantly, started to agree to a plan where they would collectively fund a, quote, bad bank to hold all of Lehman's toxic real estate. It looked like a solution was within reach. Then, on Sunday afternoon, a devastating phone call came from London. British regulators, nervous about importing America's financial mess, refused to provide the emergency approval Barclays needed to guarantee Lehman's trades. Without that guarantee, the deal was impossible. "I can't believe this is happening now," Paulson said, beside himself. The Barclays deal was dead. All eyes then turned to Bank of America, led by its CEO, Ken Lewis. But Lewis was playing his own game. He had been looking at Lehman, sure, but his real prize was Merrill Lynch, another Wall Street giant that was teetering on the edge. Over the same weekend, in a series of secret meetings, Lewis was negotiating to buy Merrill. He was basically using the Lehman crisis as leverage. By Sunday night, it was crystal clear. No one was coming to save Lehman Brothers. Paulson, Geithner, and Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke had made a pact: no bailouts. They were terrified of the political backlash and of something called moral hazard. The idea that rescuing reckless firms only encourages more recklessness. They believed the market had had 6 months since Bear Stearns to prepare for Lehman's failure. They were about to find out just how catastrophically wrong they were. Late Sunday night, the board of Lehman Brothers gathered for one final heartbreaking meeting. They received a call from Christopher Cox, the chairman of the SEC, who, under pressure from Paulson, essentially ordered them to file for bankruptcy. Just before 2 a.m. on Monday, September 15th, Lehman Brothers, a firm that had survived the Civil War, the Great Depression, and 2 world wars, filed for the largest bankruptcy in American history. Dick Fuld, the man who had given his entire life to the firm, went home to his wife. "It's over," he said, his eyes welling with tears. "It's really over." But it wasn't over, not even close. It was just the beginning. The failure of Lehman Brothers wasn't a contained explosion. It was a nuclear bomb that detonated in the heart of the global financial system. Paulson and his team had fatally miscalculated. They failed to appreciate just how deeply intertwined Lehman was with every corner of the market. When Lehman's London unit was forced to shut down, it froze billions of dollars of assets belonging to hedge funds and other investors around the world. A wave of panic selling began. The plumbing of the financial system, the networks that allowed money to flow, seized up completely. Credit markets froze solid. The contagion spread like wildfire. The very next day, the world's largest insurance company, American International Group, or AIG, was on the verge of collapse. AIG wasn't a traditional bank, but it had made a gigantic, reckless bet that had turned it into a ticking time bomb. Through a small, obscure unit in London, AIG had sold hundreds of billions of dollars worth of something called credit default swaps. Essentially, this was insurance on those same toxic mortgage-backed securities that were poisoning the system. AIG was like someone who had sold fire insurance on every house in a town built of kindling, without having any money set aside to pay the claims when everything inevitably caught fire. And now, the whole town was ablaze. With Lehman gone, AIG's trading partners, including all the big Wall Street banks, demanded that AIG immediately post billions of dollars in collateral to back up its insurance policies. It was money AIG simply didn't have. Paulson and Geithner now faced a nightmare scenario. AIG was connected to everyone and everything. Its failure would be, as one person put it, an extinction-level event. It was 10 times bigger than Lehman, and its collapse would trigger a chain reaction that would dwarf what they had just witnessed. Having just drawn a firm line in the sand declaring no more bailouts, Paulson was forced to erase it less than 48 hours later. On Tuesday night, September 16th, the U.S. government announced an $85 billion rescue of AIG in exchange for taking an almost 80% stake in the company. The government had effectively nationalized the world's largest insurance company. The hypocrisy was stunning, and it sent a fresh wave of confusion and fear rippling through the markets. The rules were changing by the hour. No one knew what to believe anymore. The panic now turned to the last two independent investment banks standing, Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs. John Mack, the CEO of Morgan Stanley, watched in horror as his firm's stock price plummeted. Hedge funds, terrified of getting their money trapped like it had been at Lehman, began pulling billions of dollars out of their accounts at Morgan Stanley. It was a classic run on the bank, happening in real time through electronic transfers. Mack was a street fighter, but he was facing an enemy he couldn't beat with toughness alone: fear. Over a terrifying week, he scrambled to find a savior. He held talks with Wachovia, another struggling bank. He negotiated with the Chinese government for a capital infusion. But his most promising hope was a deal with Japan's largest bank, Mitsubishi UFJ. For days, it was a nail-biting, around-the-clock negotiation, with the fate of his firm hanging by a thread. Finally, at the very last minute, Mitsubishi agreed to invest $9 billion, pulling Morgan Stanley back from the brink. At the same time, even the mighty Goldman Sachs, the most profitable and revered firm on Wall Street, found itself under attack. Its stock was getting hammered. Clients were getting nervous. CEO Lloyd Blankfein, realizing that the independent investment bank model was dead, made a game-changing call to his only true lifeline, Warren Buffett. In a deal hammered out over the phone, Buffett agreed to invest $5 billion in Goldman Sachs. It was more than just money. It was the ultimate seal of approval. If the world's most respected investor was betting on Goldman, it had to be safe, right? The deal was expensive for Goldman. Buffett extracted a sweet 10% dividend, but it worked. The panic around Goldman subsided. But the broader system was still in cardiac arrest. Credit markets were frozen solid. Banks weren't lending to anyone, not even to each other. Paulson realized he was playing a losing game of whack-a-mole, saving one institution only to watch another one teeter. He needed a systemic solution. He needed, as he put it, a bazooka. His staff dusted off a plan they had drafted months earlier, codenamed Break the Glass. The idea was for the government to buy up the toxic mortgage assets that were poisoning the banks' balance sheets, getting them off their books, and unclogging the credit markets. This became the Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP. Paulson went to Congress, hat in hand, and asked for an unprecedented $700 billion. He told the congressional leadership in a private meeting, his voice filled with a fear they had never heard before. If we don't act boldly, we could be in a depression deeper than the Great Depression. After a week of intense political drama, partisan bickering, and a shocking initial rejection that sent the stock market plunging nearly 800 points in a single day, Congress finally passed the bailout bill. But even as the bill was being passed, Paulson and his team were realizing the plan to buy toxic assets was too complicated and would take too long. They needed to get money into the system immediately, so they pivoted to a new, even more radical idea: direct capital injections. The government would buy stakes directly in the nation's banks. It was the final, unthinkable step. On Monday, October 13th, Paulson summoned the CEOs of the 9 largest banks in America, including Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, J.P. Morgan, and Citigroup, to a meeting at the Treasury Department in Washington. In the stately conference room, beneath the portrait of Alexander Hamilton, Paulson delivered his ultimatum. He told them that each of them would be required to take a capital injection from the U.S. government. They wouldn't be asking for the money. They would be told to take it. "We don't believe it is tenable to opt out," Paulson told the stunned CEOs, "because doing so would leave you vulnerable and exposed." Some of the bankers were furious. Dick Kovachevich of Wells Fargo, a relatively healthy bank, protested, "Why am I in this room, talking about bailing you out?" But they had no choice. Paulson had them cornered. One by one, each CEO signed a one-page document, agreeing to sell a piece of their company to the American taxpayers. John Mack of Morgan Stanley was the first to sign. He slid the paper across the mahogany table and said simply, "Done." In that moment, a line was crossed that would have seemed unimaginable just months before. The U.S. government had effectively, if temporarily, nationalized its banking system. The era of freewheeling, barely regulated capitalism that had defined a generation was over. A new, uncertain era had begun. When you close the final page of Too Big to Fail, you're left with a feeling that's hard to shake. It's this mixture of awe, anger, and a deep sense of just how fragile everything really is. The story Andrew Ross Sorkin tells isn't just about the near collapse of our financial system. It's a deeply human story about what happens when brilliance and ambition collide head-on with fear and human fallibility. The most powerful lesson from this entire saga, I think, is just how interconnected our world has become. The phrase "too big to fail" entered our everyday vocabulary for a reason. These institutions had grown so massive, so intertwined with every aspect of our economy, that the failure of just one could threaten to bring down all the others like dominoes. A bad mortgage in California could ripple through the system and threaten a pension fund in Norway. It's a stark reminder that in our globalized world, we really are all in the same boat. When one part springs a leak, we all risk sinking. But the book reveals something even deeper. This wasn't a crisis caused by some abstract, faceless system. It was a crisis caused by people, real people, who in many cases were completely blinded by their own success. They genuinely believed they had discovered a new kind of financial physics, one where risk could be engineered away through clever mathematics. They built incredibly complex models and algorithms, but they forgot a fundamental truth. Human behavior can't always be captured in a spreadsheet. Fear and greed are powerful forces, and when panic takes hold, all the brilliant models in the world become utterly useless. You see it in the story of Richard Fuld, a man so fiercely loyal to his company that he couldn't see its fatal flaws until it was far too late. You see it in Henry Paulson, a man of deep principle, forced to betray his own free market ideology to prevent complete catastrophe. You see it in the rivalries and egos of the Wall Street CEOs, who even in the middle of an existential crisis were still thinking about how to gain an edge on their competitors. So what can we actually take away from this, especially if you're still early in your journey? First, be deeply skeptical of anything that seems too good to be true. The promise of high returns with essentially no risk was the siren song that lured Wall Street onto the rocks. In finance, and really in life, there is no free lunch. Understanding risk, and more importantly, respecting it, is one of the most valuable skills you can develop. Second, really understand the power of incentives. The bonus culture on Wall Street rewarded short-term gains, actively encouraging traders to take massive risks with other people's money. When you're designing a system, or even just trying to understand one, always ask yourself, what behavior do these incentives actually encourage? More often than not, people will follow the incentives, for better or for worse. And finally, this story is a profound lesson in leadership and humility. The leaders who navigated this crisis best were the ones willing to admit what they didn't know, to question their own assumptions, and to act with a sense of responsibility that went beyond their own company's stock price. The ones who failed were often the ones whose pride and ego prevented them from seeing the reality that was staring them right in the face. Too Big to Fail is so much more than just a history of a financial crisis. It's a timeless story about power, greed, and the human drama that unfolds when the entire world hangs in the balance. That was a summary of Too Big to Fail by Andrew Ross Sorkin. We've journeyed through the core of this incredible story today, but I'll be honest with you. A summary can only ever be a map. The real treasure is found when you explore the territory yourself. The real magic of this book is in the details, the dialogue, the moment-by-moment tension that Sorkin so masterfully captures. This summary is designed to give you a framework, to help you decide if this journey is one you want to take. If anything we've talked about today has sparked your curiosity or made you think, I genuinely encourage you to grab a copy. Reading it isn't just learning about an event, it's an experience that will fundamentally change how you view the world of money, power, and the people who wield it. The link to the book is in the description. Also, if you found this summary valuable and enjoyed our time together, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. It lets me know that these conversations matter, and it ensures you won't miss our next journey into another life-changing book from the Billionaire's Bookshelf. Let's keep learning and growing together.